Wild landscape is the perfect subject. It's about shapes and form and also about distance and scale, which are things that fascinate me. I like that kind of wildness and making sense of it. For me, it's not about getting the right number of trees on the right hill. It's much more about trying to catch the feel of being there in that air, in that weather, whether it's wet or windy or sunny or whatever. It's unlikely that I would work with anything else. I find it endlessly fascinating to work with. My name's Laura Boswell and I'm here at Jackson's to talk about my printmaking. I work mainly with lino and entirely in relief printing. So my university career was one of opposition from my father. So to please him, I did a degree in art history and art. It was an excellent opportunity to look both at the history of art and all kinds of techniques, and to finally choose printmaking as something I really focused on in my final year. And that has led to me becoming a printmaker in the end. I was at university in Wales and I did a lot of architectural drawing. I used to spend a lot of time sitting on the pavement either in London or in Aberystwyth drawing the buildings. When I came back to printmaking after a career in the photographic industry, I had to find my feet again. And I thought I would go back to drawing my surroundings and architecture. And at the time I was living in Buckinghamshire, and although it's very pretty, I didn't want to draw cottages. So I moved towards landscape, and I had to learn a whole new language about landscape. I liked the idea of stripping it of all man-made things. I kind of went to the other extreme. So my work is based in linocut, also in a little bit of woodblock and Japanese woodblock. My choice there was pragmatic, really, because all these techniques relate, the woodblocks and the linocuts, both being relief methods, relate well to each other. I'm comfortable with them. I have a sort of enjoyment of that process of working with the surface of materials. For me, there's so much to discover in these techniques. It's probably something I'm never going to move on from. So there are two methods or two basic approaches in linocut. There's reduction printing and there's multi-block printing. I am a reduction printer through and through, and what reduction means is that you have one piece of lino and you use a single block, a single piece of lino to create a multicoloured print by cutting the lino away as you work. So every time you print, you might cut a little bit more of the lino away, destroying your printing block as you create your print. It's very much a one-way process, because once you start cutting that block, you can't go back. You begin with your palest colour and you work through to the darkest. The only thing you can do really as protection is to have some prints for making tests before you print the main body of the edition of prints. It's a process that I find very flexible, because you're working on one block and you're not fitting a jigsaw together. That block can change as you work. You can redraw it and you can move things and change it to a certain extent. With the woodblock printing, the Japanese technique relies on water-based pigments which are transparent, and anybody who's done watercolour painting knows you can't just layer up like I'm doing with the linocut, because the colours become muddy. So that tends to employ a multiple block process where there's a separate block for each part of the drawing. It has a kind of softness about it, so a very gentle, soft scene. It's particularly suited to distances and vistas where you have lots of maybe hills and distant views. I was lucky enough to go and study in Japan. It was an opportunity to learn from master craftsmen in the traditional way of printing. Then I did later residencies that were working with artists and were perhaps more relaxed. But I loved that first residency because it was very formal and it was very much an apprentice's learning. The discipline of that possibly was the most useful thing I learned. I learned the technique, of course, but learning that Japanese attitude to practice and discipline was absolutely invaluable. The room that I was allocated by luck, I could lie in bed and look through the window at Mount Fuji at the end of the street. So I got to see it in all kind of lights and things like that, which was fantastic. And the challenge for the residency was to create a print that was actually two prints that could be joined together seamlessly, which is quite a technical trick. I chose to do a print called Mrs. Sasuka's Garden Fuji Hiding, which was that classic kind of school child thing about the view from my bedroom. And I made it into a sort of nod to traditional Japanese printmaking, and it had a tiny little Mount Fuji in it. And that kept me going for the whole residency because it was a very technical piece of printing. It's a very delicate technique. Everything is hand printed, there's no press involved. It's a dance of steps and you have to kind of get the choreography right. Very delicate control of colour to give this kind of almost ethereal feel to it. So coming from blocky linocut, which I already loved, to this kind of multi-layered transparent watercolour process was a real revelation. And something which I found a way to bring into my linocut, still using oil-based inks and a Western method. So I still do use it occasionally, but for the most part, I use lino with a big, big nod to the kind of advantages of woodblock. The wood lithography, the Mokulito, has been fascinating to play with, and it gives you the immediacy of a drawn line. Basically, you're drawing onto wood with a waxy crayon or paint, and then printing as you would a lithograph. There's not a lot of control involved, so that has kind of the excitement of you never quite know what you're getting, and I love that. Again, you get that kind of immediacy of surface. They have a lot of white space in them, and I'm very interested in a Japanese concept called ma, which is basically, it translates to the space between endings, the idea that there is empty space that has a value as well as space with things in. So that could be in a print or a drawing, or it could be in the way you lay out your furniture in the house. Japanese prints often have sort of 30 or 40 layers to them. And my linocut prints are now increasingly transparent, and they're often layered up into the sort of high teens, 20 layers or so. I like the idea of using oil-based ink, which is quite a thick, sticky stuff, rolling it out very thin and creating these very translucent layers. I do create smooth layers of colour, but I also like putting down ink that's so thin that the texture of the paper plays a bit. And with my linocuts now, the white of the paper has a huge effect on the outcome of the print because of these very, very thin layers of ink. I work with traditional lino. It's a mixture of wood flour and linseed oil compressed onto a Hessian backing. It has a brittleness to it, a snappiness to it. And that's important for me because it means that when I go in with my tool, the lino, if I stop cutting, the lino will obligingly snap where I stop cutting. Instead of, if I was using one of the sort of plastics or vinyls, I would have to make the cut in and also make a cut out because the plastic will just tear if you try and take the end off. Whereas lino allows me to create pretty much any gestural mark that I want in my cutting. With my linocut, the basis for it comes from drawing, but the way that I draw tends to be very hasty. So I work with pen and ink, and I work with crayon, and I splash paints and pastels around. I always want to catch that kind of immediacy in the prints. For me, it's not about getting the right number of trees on the right hill. It's much more about trying to catch the feeling being there in that air, in that weather, whether it's wet or windy or sunny or whatever. I live in the southwest of Scotland, and I spend a lot of time just trying to work out why a rock is different from a tree is different from water, and how is it that rock looks heavy and that fern looks ephemeral and that water is moving. It always takes me about an hour before I draw anything worthwhile, so there's a warm-up period. And when it's practical and I'm drawing out in the landscape, these will be very quick sketches and I just keep going, and I know that I'm going to generate a lot of rubbish, but there'll be some useful things as well. So those are very immediate, scratchy, messy sketches. And sometimes I just don't have the time to sit in the landscape and draw, or I want to catch something that's very ephemeral. So I always take a lot of photographs as well. But when it comes to the print, I'll do what I would call a design drawing. And with that, what I'm doing is I'm sitting in the comfort of my studio with a cup of tea, which is very nice, and I am pulling together any sketches I've made, any photographs I've made, but also the looking that I've done at the landscape while I've been in a particular situation. So the design drawing will be the size of the finished print. I find drawing is a sort of developmental process. I know it's there, but it takes a long time to get to. So my drawings are never sort of pretty things. They're more of a kind of working journey. I've always been interested in the drawings of people who are making drawings not for themselves, but as a way of planning for something, like sculptors or potters or architects or jewellery designers. I often use a net of lines, and that's really me trying to just work out the shape and the form of things. And I've always really liked that kind of mark making. At university, because I studied history of art and it was a wide course, I learned to look at other disciplines as a reference point. So a lot of my prints have line work, or they'll have white space bordered by line, things like that. And that all goes back to that physical need to kind of almost feel my way around a shape. Drawing is a kind of curiously physical thing for me. It's a sort of real wrestling match to get that feel of the form and to describe it. I always think that I've done a lot of preparatory work and I've got everything drilled down to what I want. But in actual fact, I make a tracing of that drawing and things will change. I transfer it to the lino and things will change. And then as I'm creating the print, everything's flexible. So I never see it as a lot of preparation done up front. I have an idea of what I want to say, and I will take whatever route I need to get there. I never pin things down because I find that the evolution of the print will give me the direction and end up in a better result. I never know how many layers or what colours I'm going to use, things like that. Once I have a design drawing, I have to get it onto the lino, and I need to reverse the image. So I have a very simple way of doing that. I make a tracing, and then I simply turn the tracing face down onto the lino, and I use carbon paper. I usually let it set at least overnight where it will stay on the block and be useful. It doesn't mean I won't redraw it as I go along, but it means that I have the foundation of the original drawing there. The way that I tend to work is I make marks onto lino which I then cut around. So because I use traditional oil basting, pretty much any water-based marks I make are not going to transfer. So I use a dip pen and Indian ink quite a lot, and I like the way that it kind of skitters across the lino, and it's quite blobby and it's quite impulsive. I use felt tip brush pens quite a lot. They give a lovely line. And I also use Chinograph and as a sort of waxy version of a soft crayon to give a kind of that kind of, if you were using a soft colouring pencil on paper, it gives that kind of line. And I paint on the lino as well. That's a big part of what I do these days, is I will use brushes, and I tend to use acrylic ink, works really well. I always give my lino a very light sanding with fine sandpaper, and that tends to help it accept things like water-based paints. You can also degrease the lino using acetone if you want, and I quite often do that. It's whether you're happy to use that or not. That allows me to do a lot of drawing onto the lino as I go. So it's not a question of doing a drawing, making a transfer. That's the guide to my cutting. It's making that transfer, then I get going with the mark making and the drawing, and then I get cutting. One of the challenges about making a reduction print in colour is the order in which the colours come. Some colours are surprisingly dominant, like yellow. A pale yellow can be a very dominant colour on the colours that go on top of it, even dark colours. For me, it's the order of printing's particularly important because of the way that I work with very transparent layers. And I'm often asked about, well, what do I do first? Do I do the red, or do I do the green, or do I do the yellow? The answer is never very straightforward because it depends on what you want, whether you want to rely on an undercolour to change the colour you're printing or whether you want to hide it completely. And I've never been in the business of hiding colours completely. In my Scottish landscape is a very rocky landscape. And those sort of true greys of rocks, I know I have to kind of deal with all of those first, because if I lay down any greens or yellows or bronzes in the rest of the landscape, the minute that goes on to the grey, that's going to show. And so the shadows in my rocks will no longer be rock coloured, they'll be grass coloured. So it is a juggling match all the time to get the colours on in the right order. The best thing to do, frankly, is to do test prints to see how it works. And I'm a great believer in running tests for almost everything. I'll just put the roller and the ink onto the paper just to check how the colour layering is going to look. And I encourage people always to run tests for things like that. The inks that I use for the linocut prints that I make are oil-based. They're traditional oil-based inks, so they have a linseed base and pigment. Traditionally, I guess, for linocut, inks are very flat. It's one of the things that people often associate with linocut is this kind of flat colour. But you can push them to become very delicate and transparent. There are a couple of ways of doing that. One way is to use a product which is often called extender. It's basically it's the ink body without any colour in it. And what you're doing effectively is to sort of push the pigment particles apart so that they become thinner and more transparent. Extender's great, don't get me wrong, but it's quite sticky. And so it can become a little bit blurry on fine detail. So I would always rather go thin for fine detail. Drying oil-based inks can take a lot of time, especially colours like blacks and blues can take a long time to dry. The dryer I like is a wax. Again, it's a Cranfield product and it's a tube of wax, and you add it at about 4%, and that will drop the drying time from days and days to maybe 24 or 48 hours, which can speed things up a lot. The big thing to remember about oil-based inks of all kinds is that they're thixotropic, and that means that the more you work them with a roller, the better they will get. So when you're rolling out ink, especially the traditional sorts, take time to roll them out and work them, especially if the weather's cold, and they will reach sort of a kind of perfect condition with the rolling. So it's actually the manipulating of the ink that will give you the nice quality of ink for printmaking. When it comes to buying printing inks, especially if you're just setting out, it can be quite intimidating knowing what colours to choose. When I started, I just went for the process colours and black and white. And I always think that's a really good place to start, because you have to, out of necessity, mix your colours from scratch. And that teaches you how to produce pretty much any colour you want from a very basic range of colours. When I was a student, we had to pay for our own printing inks, and I didn't have very much money. So I was really parsimonious with my ink, and I used to use whatever colour I had finished with to mix the next colour that I wanted to use. And because I'm working usually from light to dark, that's perfectly possible. And I still do that today. And the benefit of that, quite apart from the fact that it's good for using up your inks, is that it gives you an increasingly complex colour mix. In my prints, because I'm dealing with landscape and I'm dealing with a natural subject, those soft and complicated colour mixes are really, really useful for capturing the kind of colours that you would see in nature. So I don't start the day with sort of different colours all laid out on my slab. I'm very much mixing little increments into the mother load to create my colours. And I find that a really, really helpful way of working. One of the things about printmaking that I love the most and is kind of the most important to me is the process itself and the technicality of that and the kind of demands of it. So I do my best to learn about processes and papers and inks and things like that. I have been to visit Cranfield Colours, which is the Cranfield make printing inks, and I've also gone to the Awagami factory in Japan to look at papers. There's an extraordinary amount of information that's useful as a printmaker, and seeing why things move as they do, or they print as they do, or work as they do. That's a great privilege to go off and learn things like that. I have a really wide range of cutting tools. I have a range of the classic V-shaped tools with a V profile and U-shaped tools. I met my husband when I was 17 and heroically his mother gave me a set of linocut tools that had belonged to her father. Her father was an artist called James Boswell. He did a lot of book covers and record covers. So I have his tools still, which must date from the 1930s. Whereas I often use Japanese tools designed for woodcut, which are superb with Lino. They're very, very good for just flattening out a space. But yeah, my tools are a really mixed bag of levels of professional tools and styles and shapes, really just what will do the job. If I was cutting along a straight line, for example, I might cut myself a trench with a U-tool and then use the side of the U-tool to ooch up to the line to give me a nice accurate cut rather than trying to go perfectly down the line one time. But I will also shimmy a tool, so I'll twist as I cut to create a variation in the edge. So that could be a tiny little tool where I'm just blurring the edge of a cloud by a tiny little bit, or it could be a great big shimmy to create movement in water. So how I move the tool through the lino can change quite a lot as well. And that's why it's nice to play with a variety of tools to see all of the possibilities. Paper for printmaking is an interesting one because lino, probably of all the printmaking processes, is the most forgiving when it comes to paper. But if you're going to make serious prints, then you do need a printmaking paper. But they come in a huge variety of types. For me, what I tend to do is I look to have maybe a couple of stock papers that I know inside out, I know absolutely how they're going to behave. And I use those most of the time. But then I will have papers that if I want to do something creative or I want a colour or something like that, then I will use a different paper. When I work with a printing press, I tend to use a heavier paper, so I'll use paper that's about between sort of 280 and 300 gram paper. If you're printing by hand, then you need a lightweight paper, and that's where Japanese washis really shine. So washi is a kind of catch-all term for a paper with long fibres. And those long fibres give the paper a lot of strength. So you can have a very lightweight paper, which will still take the rigours of hand burnishing and hand rubbing and give a result that's really fresh and beautiful at the end of it. So I have printed with 36 gram kitakata paper. I did a print that was about 15 layers, I think, on that. So washi paper's very, very strong. They're used a lot in book conservation because of their strength relative to their lightness. So they're very nice to use, but there are plenty of other alternatives about. They're papers that are sort of packed full of personality in how they look, the kind of sheens they have on the surface. Some have fibres that show things like that. And they're very, very interesting papers to use for printmaking. When I'm making prints, they're usually fairly large, and I have an Albion printing press to work with. And there's no question that a printing press is great for giving you consistent results and taking a lot of the physical effort out of creating a print. Hand printing is sometimes seen, especially in the context of linocut, as being a compromise because you don't have a printing press. But actually, there's a sensitivity in hand printing that you can't replicate with a press. So often when I get to the delicate parts of the print, although my print is in the bed of the press and it's set up to print, I will actually hand burnish areas because there is this communication between your hand and the paper and the print, and you're absolutely in control at that point. So I do think hand printing is a wonderful thing. My printing press is set up so that I have maybe 5 sheets of card on top of the print, and I will vary the pressure by taking out, removing card and adding card according to what area of the print that I'm working on. And that varies hugely between me hauling on the press with as much packing as possible to make an impression on a large area of lino, to just dabbing the press down when maybe I've got a few bits left at the end of the print. Reduction printing, because of its process, you're removing material from the plate. So that plate is changing all the time in the amount of material on it. And you have to change all the time as well in the amount of pressure that's needed and the way that you ink up. You need to be able to vary that. Hand printing, obviously, you have superb control over. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, what happens if you go wrong, and once you've cut a block, can you correct it? And actually, I don't ever see it like that, because inevitably when you're cutting, you might cut something that you weren't expecting to cut. But almost always there is a way out of that situation. And quite often I find that I use it as a route to develop the print in a different way. But the other thing is that the more used you get to cutting lino, the less likely you are to make mistakes. But that said, I still put big pieces of masking tape with "do not cut" or "cut this bit, not that" written across it, because everybody makes mistakes. My studio, I'm very lucky. I've had various studios of various sizes, and the new one that I have up in Scotland now is big enough to teach in, and it has a little gallery at the front that visitors can go to. But my biggest object in the room is the printing press. I have a very large Victorian cast iron printing press. So that has priority because it can't fall through the floor, the only bit of the studio that's concrete. The whole aim of the studio is to kind of make for a good workflow, because with print it's not like a static process like painting where maybe you have something on an easel that you're working on. With print it's a constant movement of paper and inks, and it's very easy to make a mess. So I try to have the studio organised so that I can move things cleanly, and then I have like an old-fashioned drying rack that I hoist up to the ceiling that the prints dry on. And hopefully this allows me to work in a kind of fluent way that keeps the prints as clean as possible. My typical working day, usually I have a combination of administration like most artists and printmaking, but if I'm only printmaking, then I always try to start with a really clear, tidy studio. And that goes back to the Japanese residencies where it was nobody ever said anything, but it was very clear that you started with a very tidy and neat desk before you started work. And I carried that across. So I try always to keep things tidy, and then I will start either cutting or printing, and the studio will gradually get more cluttered as I work. And then I often have a stop and have a re-tidy, and it helps me to think. I always think of sort of tidying up as thinking time when I'm working. My inking sheet is the one bit that doesn't get tidied up because that's always developing into a new palette. But I try to keep on top of things. And then, of course, at the end of the day, I have a proper big tidy up and a sweep. And I just find that kind of resets me for the work to come. I think I've been unusually lucky in being a printmaker in that the printmaking community is incredibly supportive and incredibly helpful to emerging printmakers. And so I had a lot of help and advice on the way, not necessarily all to do with the technical aspect of printmaking. There's a printmaker called Ian Phillips who works on landscape pictures, who's based in Wales. And I think one of the best pieces of advice I've ever had came from him. And he said, stop behaving like a woman who has a shed at the end of the garden and start behaving like an artist who has a studio. And that was a real light bulb moment and really helped me in developing as a professional printmaker. But it's very hard to list all the people that have helped because there have been so many of them. And hopefully I in turn am able to pass on some ideas. So when it comes to keeping secret techniques and sharing them, I tend to tell everybody anything. And everybody goes on a different journey. So whatever I reveal about my techniques, I know are going to be used in different ways by different people. I guess if I had a secret weapon to share, it's really obvious, but it's just to look. You really need to look at stuff. And that doesn't matter whether you're figurative or abstract or whatever. You need to know how the world works. And I was blessed with a mum. She was a dressmaker and she was very into fabrics and colour. And she always used to make me look at colours and describe them, and to look at light and how light affected colour. And you can only do that by just like staring. So I do an awful lot of staring. So I would encourage everybody just to sort of, stare into the middle of the distance. Your friends will worry about you, but it's a really helpful tip.